Hi everybody, my name is Cynthia Walker. I'm the Executive Director at the Brickstar Museum in Kennebunk. I'm here standing in front of my own seedlings that I've been putting together both for the Brickstar Museum garden coming up, as well as for my own porch garden. So here we have some a pumpkin, we have some squash, there's some corn starting to grow over here. We'll talk about some of the easier ones to do if you're starting out, and then of course the background behind Victory Gardens as we go forth. So I'm going to turn off my video, and then we will get down to what Victory Gardens are all about. So the museum in 2014 installed an indoor exhibition called Vitamin V, How Food Fought the Second World War. And with that, we installed a Victory Garden inspired by the 1940s gardens in backyards. We've continued it every year since then, and proudly, with a recent grant from a foundation called Seed Money, which is based here in Maine, we're able to expand our garden twice the size this year. Not only is this beneficial because we have more room for visitors to learn and explore in our gardens, but since we donate all of our produce to community food services, that means double the food is going back to our community. So we're really excited about that. Before I get to why you should start your own Victory Garden, I wanted to take a look back into their history. Many know the term Victory Garden from the World War II era, but they actually started in World War I and were better known then as war gardens. In August 1914, President Woodrow Wilson created the U.S. Food Administration, in part to make sure that food was properly supplied and conserved during the war. Within that administration was the National War Garden Commission, whose job it was to educate the public on planting home gardens. The big slogan that came out of that administration was the often used "Food will win the war." And the Department of Education came out with a parallel project that was named the United States School Garden Army, which sounds pretty powerful, which provided agricultural education in schools and encouraged school gardens. So what's the big idea about Victory Gardens? No matter our differences, the one thing that all humans can understand is the importance of food. So it's something that everybody needs. Situations that make it plentiful or scarce often instigate major events in history. During World War I and II, food was considered a weapon, as you can see on a couple of these propaganda posters that I have up here. So it could be used to feed soldiers and families to strengthen our resolve, and it could be withheld from enemy forces to weaken abilities. During wartime, and even now in this age of COVID-19, we've all witnessed food supplies being impacted. During the war, production was low due to so many men and women leaving for military service, and the fact that the US government had to feed millions of soldiers, plus ensure citizens at home were eating enough. So that's when something called rationing went into effect. Basically, that meant families on the home front during the World War II and I were only allowed to purchase small amounts of rationed items like meat, bread, sugar, coffee, and a lot of different things. The government once again encouraged families to start Victory Gardens in the 1940s at their own homes because anything that you grew, you had the right to keep and eat. This relieved pressure on the food supply system and then also helped people feel like they were doing their part for the war effort. Nearly 20 million Americans planted Victory Gardens in the 1940s, and that equaled to over 10 billion pounds of food in 1943 alone. So that equaled to over 1/3 of all fresh vegetables in the country at the time. That's pretty impressive. People planted gardens in their backyards, on their apartment decks, on rooftops, and in vacant lots. And families and neighbors around the country formed cooperatives and pooled resources. An interesting result, and this is one of the posters I have up, an interesting result of the focus on food was that the US military quickly realized that so many young men being drafted for war service were rejected for that service based on poor nutrition. So Congress passed the National School Lunch Act in 1946 as a matter of national security, and that remains today. So let's get back to the gardens. What you grew, you kept. You could eat vegetables and fruits fresh, or you could dry them for the winter months. If anyone's interested in a canning class, the Maine Cooperative Extension offers one that is really great. Not only were gardens used for food, but they went a long way to encourage conservation of energy, materials, water, time, money, and transportation, all of which were needed elsewhere for the war effort, and of course they're needed elsewhere today. Really great messages came out of the Office of War Information, which created now famous propaganda posters during the war, including sayings like "Our food is fighting" and "Sow the seeds for victory," as well as groups of farm workers called the U.S. Crop Corps and the Women's Land Army, both of which I think we should revive for today's Victory Garden movement. This isn't really written in any of the war guidebooks on the subject, but I hazard a guess that because of at-home production of food and less food available in general, conservation also included less food waste. So in the 1940s, families wasted 1 in 4 pounds of food, so a quarter of the food was wasted. Today, families throw out 1 in 3 pounds of food, so a third of food in this nation is wasted. What we're looking at here is a Victory Garden guide from 1943, and the next page, right here, has some great tips that we can all use today when we start our Victory Gardens. So, you know, prepare your soil. Make sure you give the plant a good chance at life with the right nutrients. Cultivate it. Make sure you water it. Get rid of any pests and weeds. Composting was big even in the 1940s. So compost helps plants to grow, and it helps you reduce waste at the same time. And then I should have said this at the beginning, as should they have, but you want to plan your garden on paper first. So when you go to plant your rows of seeds, you know what is going where, and then of course remember what is where after the fact. The don'ts are pretty fantastic too. Number 1, don't think it's too difficult. Number 2, don't try too hard. See where it takes you and don't put too much pressure on yourself. Number 3, planning for succession crops. That means once, for instance, your lettuce is ready to be harvested, you're now left with this big open space in your garden once you cut the lettuce down. So plan on something else to go in its spot so it can keep producing for you. Dig deep, that's always a good one. And then, you know, the simplest direction in the world is just read the directions on the seed packet that you get, and then most of the time you'll be pretty successful growing whatever it is that you want. So with the few minutes we have, I wanted to look at some tips for starting your own garden with your family. I'll start by saying that I myself was never gardened before doing our Victory Garden at the museum. I'm a historian by trade, so while the history of gardens really intrigues me, the actual undertaking of one daunts me to this day. But here's what I realized. Victory gardening is not about being the best gardener. Millions of regular people across the country experimented with what worked for their own plot of land and for your family. So before I go further, I'll remind you that you could live on 50 acres, 0.5 acres, or in an apartment like I do. You can still have your own garden. The point of Victory Gardens is that we all try our best. You don't have to be perfect or be a master gardener, although they are extremely talented folks, so I encourage you to ask them questions when you can. And just plant a seed and watch it grow. You could have a little pot with some soil. Now is your time to get started. So plant a couple seeds and see what comes up. If you like that, plant a few more. The next season, think about what you'd do differently, what you'd like to add or subtract. Just have some fun with it. I usually try to do my gardening with some 1940s swing music on, so really try to enjoy yourself. Gardening improves morale. It gives you something to do. Stress and anxiety melt away. You know, and I barely mentioned the environmental effects of planning and planting gardens. The obvious effects include less pressure on the national produce system. Trucks and airplanes fly produce back and forth. In turn, less gasoline and energy usage. More oxygen goes into our air thanks to plants. And that's one less area of your lawn, if you think about it, that needs chemical treatments to stay green. As I showed you, I had a couple of seedlings with me. Maybe I'll turn this back on. There we go. I have a couple of seedlings with me that we are doing for our 1940s garden. And we, like I said, we have some pumpkins growing. We're trying to stick to some of the native plants that would have been here in Maine for a long time. And I know we're going over that in a couple minutes as well. So last year, not only did we illustrate life in the 1940s, but we took a look at what vegetables were here in Maine many years ago and which came over later on. So we had an entire garden bed that was dedicated to something called the Three Sisters, which is an indigenous planting technique used by the Wabanaki and other regional tribes that use corn, squash, and beans. These three are planted together, and the corn grows tall. The squash, with its big leaves, acts as ground cover to protect the corn as well as keep it moist and everything underneath. And the beans use the corn to grow up and climb. And it's kind of this miniature little ecosystem by itself. And it's pretty impressive to watch and see and learn from. And two others that were here were, of course, sunflowers and pumpkins, also native plants. And pumpkins particularly are known to have grown here in New England for the past 5,000 years. So if you want to give that a try, they are pretty hardy and pretty impressive by October time when you're looking to do some carving. Later plants introduced by various European groups include tomatoes, basil, radishes, and cucumbers, all now really key elements of the American cuisine. So that's pretty interesting to think that they aren't actually indigenous to America. The most recent immigrant vegetable, if anybody's interested, was the artichoke, which first appeared in the United States in 1920, so only 100 years ago. So let's get to my simple steps for getting started. Since the days have been fairly cold, you want to make sure that you can start your seeds indoors. So in something like this, which is a little tray, it's a little plastic tray that you can get at Ace Hardware or many other places. You just get some soil and you get your seeds. Seeds can, once again, be bought pretty much anywhere. I've noticed that all the gardening stores seem to have racks and racks of seeds. I guess I would suggest if you're looking for something that pops up really quickly, choose the easy veggies to start. So I've listed them here, but beans, snap peas, and radishes all pop up out of the soil within 2 to 3 days of you planting them, so you can really see their development. Items that take longer are like lettuce or corn. You really have to be patient and coax it to come out of the ground. So that might you might want to pick the beans, the peas, or the radishes if you're just getting started. Next thing is you want to choose the location of your garden if you haven't done so already. Make sure it has as much sun as possible. So you're going to check, 10 a.m., noontime, 5 p.m. and see where the sun is hitting the most. And that's where you want to plant your pieces. And lastly, this is just a personal thing, but you want to make sure that whatever veggies you are planting, your family is going to eat. So you don't want to just grow things and then have to throw them out at the end of the year because nobody has eaten them. Or the other idea to do is if your family isn't going to eat all of them or some of the other vegetables, I highly recommend that you consider donating them to a local food pantry because that's a huge help to our entire community. If you are starting out, I'd recommend just using a small planter. You don't have to go full on giant garden bed. And especially if you're in an apartment like myself, you want to have kind of small trays of things. You just can't go crazy. A lot of folks you'll see are doing raised bed gardening, which is that wooden box you see sitting on people's lawns. You don't have to lean over as much when you're doing that, and you can build up some healthy soil on top of your ground soil already. So if you're going that route, the museum built its own raised beds out of 2 by 12 by 8 planks. So that's somewhere to start with. And I'll close Actually, I'll show you this slide. So here's, oops, I'm in the way, but here's some more sources to explore in terms of victory gardening. The museum's mission is to celebrate local history, and has continually offered free seeds and starter pots, like a little pack of one at our front desk. But because we're physically closed right now, we're working on a plan to make those available. So as soon as they are, I will try to get that word out. So if you want to come pick up a free seed packet at the museum, you are welcome to. And as I mentioned, a couple resources here just to get yourselves going. Of course, the museum has a Victory Garden blog that talks about what we're doing and a little bit more about the history of Victory Gardens. There's a really great website that is about climate Victory Gardens at greenamerica.org, and a place where you can add your Victory Garden to the map so people know who's growing what where. The museum's also put together a Victory Garden video how-to playlist on our YouTube channel. So that link is there if you want to have some experts better than me talk about how to plant specific seeds and how to build raised beds and everything in between. And then just a website that I love, which is the Living History Farm. They did a feature on victory gardening in the 1940s. So another chance to dive into some of that archival material that shows what they were talking about in the 1940s and how-tos from that era, if you want to give that a try. Other than that, I appreciate you taking the time, and good luck in your own victory gardening.